Welcome to Protomotive, where we talk about everything Porsche. We're talking tech, we're talking injectors, we're talking turbos, we're talking camshafts, engine stuff, horsepower. We'll talk about tires, talk about suspension. We have all kinds of fun stuff to talk about here, and hopefully you can learn something along the way. And hopefully I don't make too much of an idiot out of myself, but I'll try not to. We've been in the business for probably the better part of 45 years now, or at least I have. And we thought that we'd share some of what we've learned along the way with you. And hopefully it's interesting and fun. Today I wanted to talk about fuel injectors and proper sizing, and why you don't want too big of a fuel injector, why you wouldn't want too small of a fuel injector. We'll go both ways. But a properly sized injector will give you the best possible range and best possible drivability, best possible idle catch, fuel economy, and power. So let's start out with kind of a pet peeve I've got with people sending me tunes to do for too big of an injector, or sending cars with massive injectors in it that are completely unnecessary. In particular, an ID 1700 keeps showing up. ID 1300s on pump gas, on generic 997 turbo upgrades is just silly. They'll put 600 horsepower worth of turbos on a car, and ID 1300 injectors. Well, the stock injectors are 60 pounds. They are good for about 720 horsepower. 1300s are 110% larger, more than double the size. So now you got 14 to 1500 horsepower worth of injector in a car that's only going to be making 600 when the stock injectors would have worked. The problems that you run into with that is mostly on the low end. On high end, they'll make decent power. You could produce better power with a properly sized injector that would have better atomization. But on the low speed is where you notice it the most. And unfortunately, that's where you spend 99% of your time. And yeah, it'd be great to say that I drive my car really hard, I'm always up on power. And honestly, that's just not true. You got to get to and from your events. You got to get to and from the places that you're going. And these cars are amazing cars for all around daily use. They're not purpose-built specific cars. They could be, but that's kind of ruining the idea behind the Porsche. We've got too many clients that have Buick Grand Nationals that make 2,000 horsepower, underground Lamborghini racing 3,000 horsepower, and it just absolutely, the numbers are insane. And those cars are single purpose cars, whereas I want to drive my car to see my kids. I want to take it across state lines. I want to go across the country. I want to go to dinner. I want to go grab groceries in it. I want to go to the autocross. I want to take it to Hallett Raceway. Go to Sears Point. Let's do drive across America. Let's go to a car show. The car fits all those bills, and you come out in the garage and you look at all your cars, you know which car you want to drive. So that car has to have good manners everywhere to be able to do that, because you want to be able to turn on the AC, the cruise control, the heat when you need it. You want the thing to start and stop at stoplights. You don't want it to stall. So back to the injectors. A very large injector, too large for the situation, ends up with a super low injector millisecond. The injector millisecond, what I'm referring to there, is the injector time. You can also look at it as a duty cycle, which is the amount of time that it is open during any one revolution. You can find that pretty quickly. I think it's injector duty divided, just the injector time in milliseconds divided by 1200, and it comes up with an injector duty cycle. But anyway, the injector milliseconds, if you look at a flow chart on an injector, it's pretty linear from about 1 to 1.5 milliseconds all the way up to its maximum milliseconds. And as the milliseconds keep growing, the flow rate keeps on growing very linearly up to 90-95%, then it kind of flattens out. But on the low end, down below 1 to 1.5 milliseconds, the thing just gets garbage. It's just terrible. It becomes terribly nonlinear. It doesn't drop off at the expected rate, and the ECU is looking for a very linear flow rate versus injector milliseconds. When you put the 13s and 1700s in these cars, you run into a situation at idle and light throttle where the fuel requirement is very low, down below that 1 to 1.5 millisecond range where it becomes nonlinear. And what's happening down there is the oxygen sensing is trying to proportionately adjust the air-fuel ratios. So if it's targeting stoichiometric or 14.7 to 1 on pump gas, then the car is running around, if it's 10% rich, the ECU is trying to add 10%, the ECU is trying to pull 10% fuel to adjust the fuel value, which all sounds very straightforward. That would work if the injector was operating in its linear range, where the flow is proportionate to the injector milliseconds. However, when you're in a nonlinear range, down below 1 to 1.5 milliseconds, it's unpredictable. So the ECU may pull or add 10%, trying to enrich and lean it, where in a linear range, that would add an appropriate amount of fuel. Whereas in a nonlinear range, it's going to add the wrong amount of fuel. So the thing starts chasing the air-fuel ratio around. It added this. Oh, crap, that didn't add up to what I wanted it to. Let's add more. Well, that still didn't add up to what I wanted. Let's add more. And it just keeps chasing it, and the trims grow and grow and grow, even to the point where it absorbs it into the long-term trims. And then, lo and behold, you lift off the throttle, the engine comes down, it lands at idle, the fuel turns back on, these trims are all over the place, so the thing turns on, giving it the wrong amount of fuel based on misinformation, and the car stalls. So now you've got a car that's trimming unpredictably, doing awful things, stalling on you. Cold start can be terrible. Fuel atomization is awful down there with injector at those low of opening times. If you're running or trying to run higher pressure, there's not enough injector milliseconds to provide enough power at the coil to even open the injector. Driving around at light throttle is very similar to idle, and that you have a very low injector opening, and because of that, it'll get so low the trims will start chasing it around, and you'll run into a condition where you've got a light idle misfire, because one cylinder will be over trimmed, one will be under trimmed, because each injector behaving unpredictably ends up with unpredictable and random behavior from cylinder to cylinder. So it's just, it's not a good thing. It's not a happy thing. It's not easy to tune around what we have to. Let me back up. Part of the reason for this, and part of the reason that so many people are happy with these injectors on big super turbos, or Ford Mustang twin turbos, or big block twin turbos, or whatever, making huge horsepower where they can use these injectors, is very few of those cars have what the Porsches have that also makes these so tractable and drivable, is low and high lift and advance and retard cams. On low lift, I think the 996 turbo has 3 millimeter of lift. On the low side, the 997 turbo has 4 millimeters of lift, as compared to 10 millimeters of lift on the high lift, or with reground cams 11, 11.5, or a GT3 12 to 12.7 lift. So the low lift is just enough to drive around on and idle on. It helped with noise regulations over in Germany, TUB regulations. It helps fuel economy, helps atomization. It does a lot of great things, but also the requirement of fuel is proportionate to the requirement of air. So now you've reduced the air going into the engine with these low lift camshafts at idle and light throttle. And when you've done that, you've reduced the fuel requirement. So these things go into a range of fuel requirement that most other engines don't. Or even if you're running a big cam super or something, I mean, those things, the fuel requirement idle is huge. Massive cams, lots of airflow. You're doing all you can just to keep the thing idling anyway. Whereas these cars, we want to drive them around. We want them to work. We want them to work with the AC and the heat on and the cruise control, and want them to idle and start and cold start and do everything we want them to do all the time. So that just isn't going to happen with these. So we can kind of tune around it. Sometimes we've got to play games with it. We'll turn off the high and low lift. We'll force the thing into high lift all the time, forcing more airflow through the engine, increasing the fuel demand, which we're trying to get it up into the linear range. Other times we will increase the air-fuel ratio, which isn't right, but when you're playing with this kind of situation, just to keep the car running with improper equipment, the people want us tuners to be magicians, and that's another way we can work around it. You can play with timing, you can play with load demand, anything to get the load up, to get the airflow requirement up, to increase the fuel requirement, to get it back up into a linear range where you get rid of the misfire, you get rid of the stalling, you get rid of the O2s chasing. We get rid of the O2s chasing the air-fuel ratios around, sometimes oscillating, sometimes misfiring, sometimes just going off into Timbuktu, where they have no control over what's going on in the engine. So that's the low side of the injector milliseconds and a problem with it. On the high end, what you run into is you've got such a massive injector in there that it's more like a garden hose. If you took the sprayer nozzle off the end of a garden hose, it just kind of flows out. Versus if you've got a sprayer nozzle on there, how it sprays in a nice fan. The fan is similar to what an injector looks like, with the nozzle atomizing the fuel very well, because the fuel, you can't put liquid fuel in the combustion chamber. Isn't combustible. I mean, you can practically, don't try this, you can practically throw a lit match into a gallon of gas into the fuel and it'll just put it out. Usually it'll light it off though, because the fuel vapors sitting on top of the fuel will ignite, but the liquid fuel won't. You can really see this in diesel fuel. That stuff's even hard to light at all, because it just doesn't evaporate or vaporize. So on the high end, if you've got one of these massive injectors, we did a 996 turbo tune for a client up in Canada. They're running ID 1700s on pump with meth. This thing, up as far as 2 bar of fuel, was still only using 36% injector duty cycle. So barely a third of the injector's capacity. Why were these in there? I mean, they had already added meth, which is a fuel adder, so that decreased their fuel requirement again, and the injectors were just way oversized. So even up at full throttle, wide open throttle, high boost, the flow requirement was still very low. Versus had you had the properly sized injector in there, flowing up around 85%, you'd get a very nice atomization. You'd get better power. The atomization would be better. The power would be better because of the improved atomization, rather than just going in there as liquid fuel from the huge injector. So even though everybody seems to think I just put bigger injectors in, I'm going to make more power. Well, that's not true. What we're trying to do is supply the engine with the appropriate amount of fuel for the amount of air that's already going into it. And the amount of air is determined by boost pressure and camshaft grind and intake valves and the port size, intake manifold resonance, throttle body. There's a gazillion things. Intake air temperatures. They make complete computer models of these at Porsche and model them and provide the correct size injector, plus or minus a little bit. So too small or too large of an injector is not good on the low end and the high end, and even part, you would still benefit from a small injector. Now, what if you've got the opposite end? What if we have too small of an injector for this situation? Stock injector, and we want to make 800 horsepower. Let's do it with a 997 turbo. The numbers are easy. 60-pound injectors, 6 cylinders, 0.5 brake specific. That's 720 horsepower worth of an injector in that car on pump gas. That's at the crankshaft. So, to the wheels, the mid to high sixes, but we have seen over 700 on stock injectors. You're pushing it hard, but usually the injectors are also rated at 3 bar, and Porsches run 3.8 bar. If you run 5 bar in there, you can pick up about 15% more. So that 720 injector would now be worth 90 plus another half of that. Like 830, 840 at the crankshaft at 5 bar on stock injectors. So in theory, you could run a 997 turbo on stock injectors because the fuel pumps are good for between 900 and 1,000. That's fantastic. But the injectors are good for low 7s or 8 at 5 bar, and those pumps will handle that. So you can get there. They would be strapped out. The idle would be great. Drivability would be just like stock. The injector on the high end, what's going to happen is you run that at 100% duty cycle on the top end. Not only does the flow rate go non-linear between 90 and 100%, it kind of flattens off. So between 90 and 100%, you're not picking up much flow. And then when the injector goes static, stops pulsing, the flow pattern or the atomization just gets wonky. Kind of hard to make or picture an example of that, but the flow pattern will be really nice, and then all of a sudden it goes, when the injector goes static, goes 100% duty cycle, and so now you're getting odd flows cylinder to cylinder. And these engines are designed and developed to have very equal airflow rates under all conditions, so you can have very equal fuel injectors under all conditions to provide proper air fuel ratios. So on the top end, you start getting over 90%. If it starts tapering lean, the O2 sensor is going to start trying to add more fuel. If it's going non-linear, it's going to be adding fuel unpredictably. As you approach 100 or reach 100, the short terms, unknowing that the injector is at 100% duty cycle, will continue to try to add fuel. So the trims will just peg themselves out. So now at like 6,000 RPMs, where you can only have 20 milliseconds worth of injector on a sequential injection car, you'll all of a sudden see 25 and, well, I guess that'll add 25% max correction to it. So if you're seeing 20%, add a quarter of that to it, you'll see 25 milliseconds, which just isn't possible. So you're seeing 125% duty cycle, which isn't possible. But the ECU just keeps trying. They're kind of hardy little workers, actually. It's kind of amazing that they try to do things that are impossible. You would have thought the engineers would have kind of figured out that, hey, that's 100% duty cycle, we might as well stop. But they didn't. The trims just keep going. So that doesn't really create a issue, because chasing it around like that doesn't have a problem on top end like it does on the low end with stalling and stuff. But on the top end, what it does instead is it gives you false numbers, false corrections. So as a tuner, when we're looking at the trims to adjust your tables, it's saying that you need 25 milliseconds and you need this much up top, but it's lean. And it's like, oh, crap. We need to add 25% more fuel up here to make it right. But that's not true, because if the injector could flow, the thing would be excessively rich. So you can look at the lambda, and if the lambda is, your target is 0.8, and you're up at 0.88, you're only 10% lean at that point, but the lambdas are telling you you're 25% lean and adding 25%. They're wrong, because they're chasing it, because as they're adding fuel, they're not adding fuel, they just think they're adding fuel. So too small can create issues there as well. So the solution to that is have a properly sized injector. Plan out your power. Plan out the injector size for your power requirement. Adjust for fuel. You can take let's go. I want to make 1200 horsepower. Let's make 1200 horsepower on pump gas. 0.5 brake specific, so we need 600 pounds per minute of flow. 6-cylinder, we need 100 pound injectors per cylinder. So that's about 1100 cc injectors at 100% duty cycle. So for 1200, we can absolutely maxed out at the limit run 100 pound or 1100 cc injectors. However, we don't want to get them into that nonlinear range, so we need to bump that up about 15% to keep them in the 80 to 85% range maxed out. So we're going to take that 1100 number and add another 110, so it's 1210 plus another 5, 50, so we're at 1260. So a 1300 cc injector would be fantastic in that situation for 1200 horsepower pump gas. But say we want to run it on E85. E85 has a 35% higher fuel demand because the stoichiometry point, the stoichiometric of pump gas is 14.7. I believe E85 is around 8.5. A lot of people say run it rich. We're not having that experience on the Porsches. It's just as happy at a 0.8 lambda demand as pump gas is. So we're seeing somewhere between a 32 to 35% increase in fuel demand with E85. So now we need those 1300s at 1200 horsepower. But remember to look for your pump also, because the stock pumps, even though they flow between 900 to 1,000 horsepower on pump gas, put E85 in it, you're barely hitting 700 on the stock pumps. So now we need to saddle a third pump in there, or increase both pumps to get up to the fuel requirement. But just pumps and injectors sometimes don't do it all. A stock 997 turbo chassis line can flow enough for about 1,000 horsepower on E85. It's very close to like what would be a Dash 7, whereas a Dash 8 we've run all kinds of horsepower through. 996 turbo has a tiny line. It's about the equivalent of a Dash 5. And on a 996 turbo, you're doing good to run somewhere between 700 to 750 on E85 in a 996 turbo. So not only do you need the pumps and the injectors, but you also need the fuel lines and the feed and the return. Because you got to remember, when you have that much pump, when you're not using it at idle, you've got to return it to the tank. So you either need to put a giant regulator in the rear, or like we do on some of our big fuel system kits, we'll put a secondary regulator up front to take care of the overflow. We can also hop switch them, which is a pressure switch that'll turn on the third pump only when you need it. Turn it on at 7 to 10 psi. Some of the Syvex guys are running a pulse width modulated second and third pumps. Some of the Syvex guys or Motec guys will run pulse width modulated uh, pumps. That's where they vary the pulse width of the pump according to the fuel demand, which is a really fun idea. Actually, the 2010.2 turbo started doing that. The GT3 does the same thing. Not the primary pump just turns on and off, but the secondary pump is pulse width modulated. So there's different ways to tackle the fuel demand, to tackle the fuel return, to tackle the overall fuel demand. Um, if you're running meth, depending on the nozzle size, you can run 50, 75, 100, 150, maybe even 200 horsepower worth of extra fuel in your meth. So remember that when you are sizing your injectors, like on a 996 turbo, where you might be running out in the that low to mid 500s on pump gas. If you just added meth, all of a sudden you can make 600 and change on the stock injectors. On a 997.2 turbo, methanol is magic, because the early 2010 to 2012 or something, those had a fuel limitation issue, so that always limited the power. So you put meth in those cars, and all of a sudden you can make all kinds of horsepower with them, because they would do all kinds of weird things with throttle closure and load decreases and engine protection, based on the fuel requirement. When it saw that it didn't have enough fuel, it would back off the power requirement. So if you add a bunch of fuel in it with meth, all of a sudden the fuel requirement is lower, and the ECU allows you to push the power a lot further on it. So meth injection can have some benefits in some places well beyond their means of only cooling and a fuel adder and an octane. It can kind of fool the ECU into doing things it never intended on doing. So anyway, there's our, I don't know, a lesson on injectors, I guess. Too big, too small, just right. It sounds like Goldilocks and the Three Little Bears, but it's true. Try to get the correct injector on there. You might think I'm a magician at tuning. Yeah, I can do a lot of magic, but at the end of the day, let's just put a proper size injector in there. I'm not saying I'm lazy and it's just making my job easier. It's just making a better car for you. It's making a better package. You'll really enjoy the overall experience of the car so much better under all conditions. So let's try that. Thanks, and have a great day.